Thank you for joining. My name is Daniel, and I'm presenting this paper also on behalf of my colleagues at UCL, Skopje, and Dresden. In this paper, we simulated the exploration of articulation to imitate consonant-vowel stimuli and evaluated the outcomes by means of word recognition experiments. This work is part of a larger project to test specific phonetic hypotheses by simulating early vocal learning, and we would like to thank the Leverhulme Trust for funding the project. We are interested in the task of obtaining articulatory movements from prototypical speech examples with two broad objectives. Firstly, the process should have some commonalities with real speech acquisition from a computational perspective and allow us to test specific phonetic assumptions of speech production. And more practically, it will allow the reproduction of recorded speech with an articulatory synthesizer, a task that can be time-consuming if done manually. Having an articulatory synthesizer with the ability to produce realistic speech may in turn have applications in text-to-speech synthesis and automatic speech recognition. A minimal process for articulatory exploration is shown here. The process requires an input speech sound from an external speaker and would be capable of three distinct sub-processes: articulatory exploration, speech production, and perception. Firstly, perception of the input speech and production stage is likely multimodal, involving auditory, tactile, and visual information, and we assume that perception may drive articulatory exploration to some extent. Note that this diagram does not show realistic architecture for real speech acquisition, only the articulatory exploration process directly needed for imitation, which is also the extent of the scope of this paper. However, we assume that these components exist in some form in human speech acquisition. Within this framework, we investigated the following aspects. A comparison was made between uniform sampling and derivative-free optimization algorithms for articulatory exploration. Regarding speech production, we tested an implementation of consonant-vowel co-articulation and a simple kinematic model to generate the dynamics of articulatory movements. And lastly, automatic speech recognition was considered as a tool to evaluate different simulation settings in terms of intelligibility. The following experimental setup was implemented to probe these research questions. All experiments started with single word recordings by a British male speaker from which we extracted consonant vowel onsets and concluded with a word recognition task. The set of inputs contained 7 British English vowels and 3 voiced plosives, and the process was repeated for each word using different random seeds. Articulatory exploration was implemented as sampling of static targets either uniformly or driven by the optimization algorithm and objective function. Speech production from these targets was implemented by converting them into articulatory trajectories, driving the vocal tract lab synthesizer, as we will describe in the next slide. And finally, the objective function was the mean squared error between the acoustic features of the input and produced speech. Here we used mel-frequency Kepsel coefficients and did not implement visual or tactile feedback. The results we will present later are also shown in this diagram on the component of interest. We will discuss the setup of the first experiment in more detail next. The second compares the sampling methods, and the final experiment compared the word recognition rates between the ASR system and human listeners. Vocal Tract Lab presents a large number of parameters for control of the glottis and upper vocal tract. Since we only considered voice sounds, the glottal parameter values were fixed for modal phonation. For the upper vocal tract, the majority of the available parameters were used, as shown here, with the exception of the tongue side parameters. In essence, a laterally flat tongue surface was assumed. As mentioned before, static values of the 15 free parameters were sampled for each of the consonant and vowel segments. In our first experiment, we compared allowing both the consonant and vowel segments the full set of 15 free parameters, which we called the free onset configuration, with reduced sets depending on the consonant shown here as the tied onset configuration. In the tied onset configuration, The undetermined consonant parameters are shared with or tied to the parameter values found for the vowel segment. This is motivated by the interpretation of co-articulation as the simultaneous movement of non-conflicting articulatory dimensions associated with the consonant and the vowel, all commencing at the onset of the syllable. As shown on the right, the static targets are converted into trajectories, assuming smooth transitions of all parameters at a similar rate. This drives the physical simulation by Vocal Tract Lab to produce speech. The results of the first experiment comparing the free and tied onset configurations just described is shown here. For each input word, the best optimization algorithm, which we will discuss later, was given 10,000 iterations to find relevant articulatory targets, and the output words were evaluated by a state-of-the-art commercial speech recognition system. As mentioned earlier, experimental runs were repeated, which allows us to show the success rates and confidence intervals here. Overall, we found significantly better success rates with the tied onset configuration, largely due to more successful bilabial plosives. The result is not surprising considering the scheme effectively constitutes additional information about the consonant and reduces the search space significantly. However, the results also mean that our implementation of syllable synchronized co-articulation may be accurate. The next result is a comparison of word recognition rates over the number of exploration iterations, algorithms, and evaluators. The first group of results is associated with a controlled random search algorithm. The second with the model-based exploration using a random forest to model the objective function distribution. And the last group, simple uniform sampling. Focusing on the ASR results over 1, 5, and 10,000 iterations for each group, we make two observations. CRS performed significantly better than uniform sampling with only 1,000 iterations. And model-based optimization with the acquisition function we tested did not benefit from increasing the number of iterations. For CRS and uniform sampling, an online recognition experiment with human listeners was also performed. Recognition rates can be compared between these methods and with the ASR recognition rates, 10,000 iterations. Here we see that when using CRS, that human and ASR recognition rates were not significantly different in our experiments. A further examination of the ASR and human recognition rates shows that certain words, notably bod, bud, and did, were better recognized by humans. This is perhaps due to systematic biases in the system, considering bod and bud are uncommon words in English, and did is a high-frequency grammatical word. Human recognition rates were lower for the words dad and dead, with further examination indicating higher B versus D consonant confusion. Since these experiments, a new version of Vocal Tract Lab has been released, which may improve the quality of plosives. Amongst other updates, the default time resolution of the simulation has been increased. For a deeper investigation of these recognition rates, it is necessary to look at the confusion matrix included in the paper, as regrettably, the coda attached to the CV sounds also played a role in misrecognitions. This work has presented detailed results in terms of intelligibility that may serve as baselines for planned future work on computational speech acquisition and indications for phonetic refinements such as the control parameters for velar plosives. Furthermore, it has shown that parameter tying motivated by syllable synchronized co-articulation is a promising mechanism for reducing the search space during articulatory exploration. Thank you for listening.